She had 2 million followers who believed they were watching her life in real time. They saw the penthouses, the private jets, and the curated perfection of a woman who had monetized the American dream. To the internet, Courtney Clenney was the ultimate success story, a digital icon living in a world of filters and golden lighting. But the reality of who she was wasn't captured on an iPhone. It was captured by a silent security camera in a Miami elevator. To the public, she was a lover. To the man bleeding out on her floor, she was the only danger in the room. 2 versions of Courtney existed, and on April 3, 2022, they finally collided. Miami, Florida. The city is a neon-soaked promise of excess, where status is the only currency that matters. And nowhere was that status more visible than at One Paraiso, a luxury skyscraper looming over Biscayne Bay. This is where the elite go to be seen, and it's where Courtney Clenney and Christian Obumseli built their fortress. On the surface, they were the power couple of the modern age. Courtney, known online as Courtney Taylor, was an OnlyFans titan, raking in millions. Christian was a cryptocurrency investor with a magnetic smile and a future that seemed just as bright. Their social media feeds were a testament to a life without limits. Dinners at Komodo, weekends in Tulum, a love story written in hashtags and heart emojis. They were young, beautiful, and rich. They were the people everyone else wanted to be. But walls in luxury high-rises are thick, and they are very good at keeping secrets. On the afternoon of April 3rd, the sun was blazing over the marina. It was a Sunday. The building was quiet. Residents were lounging by the pool or heading out for brunch. But inside Unit 2205, the silence had been shattered hours ago. At 4:57 p.m., the Miami-Dade Police Department received a frantic 911 call. The voice on the other end wasn't the polished, confident influencer her fans knew. It was a woman in the grip of hysteria. She was screaming that her boyfriend was dying. She was begging for help. When officers arrived, the scene that greeted them dismantled the Instagram fantasy instantly. The pristine white floors of the luxury apartment were slick with red. Christian Obumseli, the man who had smiled so brightly in every photo, was lying on the ground, his life draining away from a single, deep stab wound to the chest. And there was Courtney. She wasn't posing, she wasn't filtered. She was sitting on the floor, drenched in blood that wasn't hers, wearing only a bra and sweatpants. Her hands, usually manicured for the camera, were trembling as police restrained her. The officers on the scene saw a grieving girlfriend, a woman traumatized by a sudden, violent tragedy. She told them it was self-defense. She said he had attacked her. She said she had no choice. She was the victim, fighting for her life against a man who had turned on her. In that chaotic moment, the narrative seemed plausible. Domestic disputes happen, tragedies happen, even in castles in the sky. The police saw a small blonde woman and a muscular man, and the physics of the situation seemed to support her story. He was the aggressor, she was the survivor. But narratives are fragile things. They require consistency. And while Courtney was sobbing into the shoulder of a first responder, telling the story of a woman who had just saved her own life, the apartment was telling a different story. There is a terrifying reality about true crime stories like this one. They don't happen in a vacuum. They are often buried under layers of wealth and influence that make the truth hard to see. Christian Obumseli's voice was silenced that afternoon, and without intervention, his side of the story might have vanished entirely. The algorithm doesn't favor the victim, it favors the survivor who controls the account. Hit the like button right now, not for the algorithm, but to help us force Christian's story into the light. Help us ensure that the truth isn't bought and paid for. The police rushed Christian to Jackson Memorial Hospital, but it was too late. The damage was catastrophic. The subclavian artery had been severed. At 5:55 p.m., Christian Obumseli was pronounced dead. Back at the apartment, the investigation was just beginning, and immediately the self-defense theory began to show cracks. Detectives started looking closer at the scene. They saw the knife. It wasn't a small pocket knife or a tool grabbed in a panic. It was a kitchen knife with a blade suited for a chef, driven with precision and force. They looked at Courtney. Under the blood, where were her injuries? If she had been fighting for her life against a strong, athletic man, there should be bruises, cuts, defensive wounds, signs of a desperate struggle. But as they photographed her, the physical evidence of a brutal attack on her seemed missing. Then they started talking to the neighbors. In a building like One Paraiso, people value their privacy, but they also hear everything. And what the neighbors told the detectives didn't match the story of a sudden, isolated incident. They spoke of months of screaming. They spoke of the police being called to the unit so many times that the building management had actually moved to evict the couple. They described a relationship that wasn't a love story, but a war zone. And then there was the timeline. Courtney claimed the stabbing happened in the heat of the moment, a split-second reaction to a threat. But as investigators began to pull the digital data, the phone records, the text messages, and the audio recordings that Courtney herself had made, they found something chilling. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a glitch in a perfect life. This was the crescendo of a symphony of violence that had been playing for months. The police took Courtney to the station. She was still hysterical, still playing the role of the devastated girlfriend. But while she sat in the interrogation room, crying for her baby, the detectives were about to access a piece of evidence that she had likely forgotten existed. It wasn't in the apartment. It wasn't on her phone. It was in the elevator. The building security system had been recording for weeks. It had seen them coming home from dinners. It had seen them leaving for parties. And on a day in February, weeks before the murder, it had captured a moment that would shatter Courtney's defense into a million pieces. The video didn't show a woman afraid of her boyfriend. It didn't show a victim cowering in the corner. It showed the hunter. The most dangerous lies are the ones that are 90% true. Courtney admitted she stabbed him. That was the truth, but the lie was in the why. For months, while Christian's family begged for answers, Courtney Clenney walked free. The police had released her, citing the self-defense claim. She was posting on Instagram. She was spotted at hotel bars. She was living her life while Christian was in a morgue. But behind the scenes, the investigation had turned into a digital excavation. The detectives weren't just looking at the day of the murder. They were looking at the entire history of the war between Unit 2205's residents. They started with the elevator footage. When investigators played the tape from February, 2 months prior to the killing, the dynamic of the relationship was laid bare in high definition. The doors opened, and Courtney didn't look like a woman fearing for her safety. She looked like a predator. The video shows Courtney launching a relentless physical assault on Christian. She punches him, she kicks him, she pulls his hair. And Christian, the aggressor, he stands there. He holds his hands up, not to strike, but to block. He tries to calm her down. He retreats. At one point, he tries to push her away gently, and she lunges back in, consumed by a rage that seemed too big for her small frame. It was a total inversion of her story. The victim was the one throwing the punches. The monster was the one trying to de-escalate. But video has no sound. To understand the psychology, the detectives needed to hear them. And Courtney, in a twist of narcissism that would be her undoing, had recorded their arguments on her own phone. Hours of audio files were recovered. Listening to them is an endurance test. Shut up and let me slap you, dumbass.
That is Courtney's voice. Clear as day, screaming at Christian. You hear the sound of physical blows. You hear Christian in the background, his voice low, exhausted, apologizing for things he didn't do, begging her to stop. She calls him worthless. She uses racial slurs. She treats him not like a partner, but like property that is malfunctioning. The detectives realized they weren't dealing with a domestic dispute that went wrong. They were listening to a pattern of systematic abuse. This is known as coercive control. It's a strategy used by abusers to dominate their partners, to break down their reality until they accept the violence as normal. Christian wasn't staying because he was violent. He was staying because he was trapped in the psychological web she had spun. The law says everyone is innocent until proven guilty. It requires us to look at the context, but looking at this elevator footage, seeing a man refuse to hit back while being assaulted and hearing him apologize while being beaten, do you agree with the initial decision to let her walk free? Or do you see a system that was blinded by her appearance? Tell me in the comments below. The investigation was now moving from self-defense to second-degree murder. but they needed the smoking gun. They needed to prove that the moment of death wasn't an accident. They turned to the autopsy report. Courtney claimed she threw the knife from a distance, or that she held it out and he fell onto it. It's a common defense. I didn't mean to do it. The medical examiner's report destroyed that theory in a single sentence. The wound was 3 inches deep. It penetrated the subclavian artery, but crucially, the angle was downward. You don't get a downward angle from a defensive throw. You don't get that kind of force from a warning jab. That angle requires intent. It requires a raised arm and a downward thrust. And then, the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place: the timeline of the 911 call. On the call, Courtney is screaming that he is dying, but forensic analysis of the blood spatter and the coagulation suggested that Christian hadn't just been stabbed the second she picked up the phone. There was a gap, a window of time where Christian was bleeding out, and Courtney was doing what? She wasn't calling 911 immediately. She was on the phone with her parents. The detectives realized the hysteria on the 911 call might have been real, but it wasn't the immediate reaction to the stabbing. It was the reaction to the realization that he wasn't waking up. The state attorney had seen enough. The scared girlfriend mask had fully slipped. They had the video of her violence, they had the audio of her hatred, and they had the body of a man who died with his hands down. Courtney Clenney wasn't in Miami anymore. She had fled to Hawaii, checking into a luxury rehab facility, perhaps hoping the distance and the diagnosis of PTSD would shield her. But the long arm of the law has a terrifying reach. On August 10th, 2022, 4 months after Christian took his last breath, the illusion of safety shattered for Courtney. U.S. Marshals tracked her down. She wasn't wearing designer clothes or streaming to millions. She was in handcuffs, facing a charge that carried a life sentence. The descent was over. The trial was about to begin, and the defense she had crafted so carefully was about to face the most brutal scrutiny of all. The court of public opinion had already delivered its verdict, but the court of law operates on a different timeline. As Courtney Clenney stood before the judge, the glamour was gone. The filters were stripped away. She wore an orange jumpsuit, her hair unkempt, a stark contrast to the polished influencer who had once commanded the attention of millions. This was the reality of murder, cold, bureaucratic, and utterly devoid of luxury. The legal battle that ensued was a high-stakes chess match. Her defense team, paid for by the millions she had accrued, doubled down on the self-defense narrative. They painted Courtney as a victim of a toxic relationship, a woman pushed to the brink by a controlling man. They argued that the elevator footage was just a snippet, lacking context. They claimed the audio recordings were mutual arguments, not one-sided abuse. They tried to turn the victim into the villain, a tactic as old as the justice system itself. But the prosecution had a narrative that was harder to break: the truth. They didn't just present evidence, they presented a psychology. They brought in experts to explain the dynamics of the relationship. They showed how Courtney's aggression wasn't reactive, but proactive. They used her own words against her, playing the audio clips where she demeaned Christian, where she threatened him, where she admitted to wanting to kill him. "I really want to kill you," she had said in one recording. At the time, it might have sounded like hyperbole. In the courtroom, it sounded like a confession. The trial wasn't just about who held the knife, it was about power. Who held the power in that relationship? Was it the muscular man who could have physically dominated her but didn't? Or was it the wealthy woman who controlled the finances, who controlled the narrative, and who ultimately controlled whether he lived or died? The prosecution argued that Courtney Clenney killed Christian Obumseli not because she feared him, but because she was losing control of him. It was the ultimate act of possession. If she couldn't own him, no one would. As the evidence mounted, the demeanor of the grieving girlfriend shifted. In court hearings, cameras caught glimpses of annoyance, of boredom, of arrogance. The mask of the victim didn't fit quite right anymore. The public saw a woman who seemed more concerned with the inconvenience of her incarceration than the loss of the man she claimed to love.
And then there was the family, Christian's family. They sat in the courtroom day after day, listening to the defense drag their son's name through the mud. They watched the videos of him being beaten. They heard the audio of him being screamed at. Their pain was the only thing in that room that felt undeniably real. They weren't looking for fame. They weren't looking for followers. They were looking for justice for a son who had been stolen from them by a woman who treated people like disposable content. The legal proceedings are still a slow-moving beast, but the evidence we have seen paints a picture that is hard to ignore. It suggests that in our obsession with beauty and wealth, we often overlook the darkness that hides behind the ring light. We excuse behavior from the rich that we would condemn in the poor. We assume that a beautiful face cannot hide a violent heart. Christian Obumseli's death forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about domestic violence. It reminds us that men can be victims too. It reminds us that abuse doesn't always look like a bruised face. Sometimes it looks like a relentless psychological siege. And it reminds us that the people we idolize on screens are often strangers to us in reality. We are building a community here dedicated to exposing the evil that the world wants to ignore. We don't just watch stories, we analyze them, we remember the victims, and we demand better. If you believe that justice should be blind to fame and fortune, subscribe to join the investigation. We are just getting started. Courtney Clenney built her empire on an image. She sold a fantasy. But in the end, the only thing she truly produced was a tragedy. She wanted the world to watch her. And now, finally, we are watching. But we aren't liking what we see. The elevator doors have closed. The camera has stopped recording. But the echo of that final scream still lingers in the hallway of One Paraiso, and it asks a question that will haunt the internet forever. How many other monsters are hiding in plain sight, just one swipe away?